It was just another humid Friday afternoon in Atlanta. The sun glared down relentlessly as Simone Ellis, a poised and confident black woman in her early 30s, exited a bustling coffee shop. Dressed in a sleek, Nava blue suit and carrying her briefcase, Simone exuded an aura of elegance and determination. Unbeknownst to the onlookers, this wasn't just any suit. It was her armor, one she wore as a high-powered defense attorney. Brianna had just wrapped up a grueling week of court hearings and looked forward to a relaxing weekend. She approached her sleek black sedan parked at the curb, ready to head home. As she reached for the door handle, the blare of a police siren cut through the air, making heads turn. A patrol car screeched to a halt just feet away from her. "Hey, you!" barked the officer, stepping out of the vehicle. He was a middle-aged white man with a stocky build, a sharp jawline, and a pair of mirrored sunglasses that reflected the midday sun. His hand hovered near the holster of his gun. "What are you doing near that car?" Brianna froze, her hand still on the door handle. Her heart quickened, but her face remained calm. She'd been here before, not this exact scenario, but the tense and unnerving moments where prejudice made her a suspect for simply existing. "This is my car, officer," she said evenly, her voice calm but firm. The officer scoffed, his lips twisting into a smirk. "Yeah, right. Step away from the vehicle, hands where I can see them." His tone wasn't just commanding. It dripped with suspicion, almost as if he'd already made up his mind about her. Brianna's eyes narrowed slightly. She knew better than to escalate, but she wasn't about to back down either. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice steady. "I said step away." The officer barked again, louder this time, drawing the attention of passers. By a few people slowed down, whispering as they watched the scene unfold. Brianna slowly raised her hands, her briefcase dangling in her left hand. "Officer, I assure you, this is my car. My name is Brianna Ellis. Would you like to see my ID?" But the officer didn't seem interested in her words. His hand moved to his radio. "We've got a suspicious individual at Main and Elm. Black female, possibly attempting vehicle theft," he said into the device, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Brianna's jaw clenched, but she didn't let her frustration show. "Suspicious individual." She repeated, tilting her head. "And what exactly makes me suspicious?" "Officer?" He pointed to her briefcase, his voice dripping with condescension. "What's in the bag? Tools to break in, maybe?" The question hung in the air, thick with accusation and implication. Brianna remained composed, but inside, she was calculating her next move. This wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated, and if the officer wanted a show, she was more than ready to give him one. The crowd around them began to grow. A few pedestrians stopped to record the interaction on their phones, the murmurs of curiosity and unease rippling through the air. Brianna stood her ground, still holding her briefcase. Her polished demeanor remained intact, but her mind raced, weighing her options. She could already see where this was going. The officer took a step closer, his mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes, but the tight line of his mouth betrayed his thoughts. "Open the briefcase," he demanded. Brianna arched a brow, the faintest trace of a smirk tugging at her lips. "I don't think so," she said smoothly. "You don't have a warrant, and I have nothing to prove to you." Her calm defiance clearly struck a nerve. His face reddened, and he jabbed a finger in her direction. "Don't get smart with me. If you're refusing to cooperate, I'll have to assume you're hiding something." "Hiding something," she echoed, her voice sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Officer, you're escalating a situation without cause. This is harassment, plain and simple." He chuckled darkly. "Harassment? Lady, I'm doing my job. You think you can just walk up to a car like this, dress like?" He gestured vaguely at her, his words faltering, "like you don't belong." The weight of his words landed like a thunderclap. Brianna's eyes narrowed, her patience thinning. "Dress like I don't belong," she repeated, her tone icy. "And how exactly does someone who belongs look, officer?" The officer's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, It seemed he realized he'd spoken too freely. But he recovered quickly, straightening his posture. "Let me see your ID." He snapped, his voice firm. Brianna sighed softly and set her briefcase on the hood of the car, moving slowly to reach into her blazer pocket. The officer tensed as if anticipating a threat, his hand brushing his holster. "Relax," Brianna said, her tone as cool as ever. "I'm reaching for my wallet." She pulled out her ID and extended it toward him. "Here you go. Take a good look." He snatched the ID from her hand, his eyes flickering down to the card. As he read her name and title, Brianna Ellis-esque, the confidence in his posture wavered for just a moment, but he quickly masked it, handing the card back to her with a dismissive gesture. "Doesn't prove anything," he muttered. "Anyone can fake an ID." Brianna let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "Of course. Why stop at baseless accusations when you can double down on them?" She folded her arms, her gaze piercing through him. "Tell me, officer, do you go around treating everyone like this, or is it just the ones who look like me?" Her words hung in the air loud, and clear the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A young man holding a smartphone called out, "She's got him now." The officer glanced nervously at the growing number of cameras trained on him. But Brianna wasn't finished. She stepped forward, her voice low and deliberate. "Let me save you some time. You're trying to intimidate the wrong person today. And trust me, you'll regret it if you keep this up." For the first time, the officer hesitated, the confidence in his bluster faltering. Yet rather than backing down, he squared his shoulders, clearly deciding to dig himself deeper. "I'll be the judge of that." He shot back, his tone defiant. "Now step away from the car or I'll have to detain you." The crowd gasped. Brianna's expression didn't waver, but inside, her resolve hardened. If this officer thought he could bulldoze her into submission, he was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. Brianna remained rooted in place, her posture unwavering as she locked eyes with the officer. Around her, the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. The smartphones pointed in her direction captured every detail of the unfolding confrontation, ensuring that what happened next wouldn't go unnoticed. The officer, however, seemed undeterred by the growing attention. His ego now locked in a battle he didn't fully understand. "Detain me," Brianna repeated, her voice calm yet laced with incredulity. She took a deliberate step toward him, her movements measured, each word dripping with deliberate emphasis. "For what exactly?" Parking near my own car while black, the officer's hand moved toward his cuffs, his face hardening with frustration. "For failing to comply with a lawful order," he retorted, his voice rising in an attempt to reassert control. "Lawful?" Brianna arched a perfectly groomed brow, her voice cutting through the noise like a razor. "Since when is an unlawful search of my property considered lawful? Since when is racial profiling part of your job description?" The crowd responded with scattered gasps and murmurs of agreement. Someone called out, "Yeah, answer her." The officer's jaw clenched as the tide of public opinion began to shift against him. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he snapped, his tone defensive but less certain now. "No, you don't," Brianna replied coolly. "But you will have to explain yourself to a judge if you continue down this road." She took another step forward, standing just inches from him now. Her presence was formidable, her words delivered with the precision of someone who had spent years dismantling weak arguments in courtrooms. "You're making a lot of assumptions right now, officer. And you know what they say about assumptions, don't you?" The officer's face reddened, his composure cracking further under the weight of her calm defiance. He opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a new voicier man's voice, deep and authoritative. "What seems to be the problem here?" The crowd parted slightly as a second police officer approached. This one was younger, perhaps in his late 20s, with a more measured demeanor. His badge glinted in the sunlight as he assessed the scene, his gaze flicking between the older officer, Brianna, and the crowd. She was acting suspicious near this vehicle. The older officer began, his voice tight with irritation, refused to comply. The younger officer frowned, clearly skeptical. "Suspicious how?" he asked, his tone neutral but pointed. She claims it's her car, the older officer said dismissively, waving a hand at the sleek sedan. It is my car, Brianna interjected, her voice steady. She pointed to her briefcase on the hood. My registration and insurance are in there, if anyone cares to check. Or we can stand here while you fabricate more excuses to justify this. My registration and insurance are in there, if anyone cares to check. Or we can stand here while you fabricate more excuses to justify this nonsense. Your choice. The younger officer's expression shifted as he began to piece things together. He stepped toward Brianna, lowering his voice. Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience. If you'll allow me to verify your documents, we can clear this up quickly. Brianna regarded him for a moment, her sharp gaze taking in his body language and tone. Unlike his colleague, this one didn't seem hostile, just cautious. Finally, she nodded and opened her briefcase, retrieving her registration and insurance papers. The younger officer examined them briefly before nodding. Everything checks out. This is her vehicle. He turned to the older officer, his expression neutral, but his tone firm. It looks like there's been a misunderstanding. The older officer's face twisted in frustration, but before he could respond, Brianna spoke up. A misunderstanding, she repeated, her voice calm but cutting. No, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was harassment, and I hope you're ready to deal with the fallout. The younger officer's expression shifted to one of quiet unease. The older officer, however, crossed his arms, still unwilling to admit fault. I was doing my job, he muttered. Brianna stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low, commanding tone that only the officers could hear. Oh, you've done your job all right, and you've just given me everything I need to do mine. Now, what's it going to be? Are you going to apologize? Or should I start preparing the lawsuit? The older officer blinked, clearly taken aback by her words. But before he could respond, the younger officer stepped in. Ma'am, I assure you will address this internally, he said quickly, shooting a warning glance at his colleague. We deeply regret this incident, but Brianna wasn't ready to let them off the hook just yet. Not when the crowd was watching, not when the cameras were rolling. She turned to face the gathering of onlookers, her voice carrying with the weight of righteous indignation. You all saw what happened here today, she said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. This is what black people face every day in this country: assumptions, accusations, and humiliation, all because of the color of our skin. But let me tell you something. I will not let this slide. Not today, not ever. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, their energy electrifying the air. The older officer looked visibly shaken now, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. And Brianna, she stood tall, her chin held high, ready to take this fight as far as it needed to go. The crowd's applause echoed in the background as Brianna remained steadfast, her gaze cutting through the tension like a blade. The older officer, now visibly flustered, fumbled for words, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for an escape from the moment he'd created. Meanwhile, the younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his initial attempt to defuse the situation having failed spectacularly under the weight of Brianna's unyielding stance. Miss Ellis, the younger officer, began cautiously, addressing her by the name he had read on her paperwork. I understand you're upset, Brianna interrupted, her voice calm yet laced with unmistakable steel. No, officer, upset is what I get when my coffee order is wrong. She gestured broadly at the scene around her. This is systemic. This is intentional. And if you think I'm letting it slide, you've grossly underestimated me. The crowd murmured in agreement. A middle-aged woman near the front spoke up, her phone still recording. You tell him, girl. We've got your back. The younger officer visibly swallowed, his resolve cracking under the growing weight of public scrutiny. But the older officer still hadn't learned his lesson. He stepped forward, trying to reclaim some semblance of authority. All right, that's enough, he barked, his tone sharp. Disperse. All of you. This is official police business. The crowd didn't move. Instead, their defiance grew. A young man in a hoodie shouted, "Nah, we're staying right here. We saw everything." Others cheered in agreement, their voices rising in solidarity. Brianna smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. She turned back to the older officer, her voice low and deliberate. "You can't silence them, not today. And certainly not when you've made yourself the star of their videos." The officer's face flushed crimson. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he spat. Brianna's smile widened, a flash of confidence that was equal parts intimidating and awe-inspiring. "Oh, I don't think I'm smart. I know I'm smart. And the irony is, if you had bothered to ask a single question before making your baseless assumptions, you might have known it too." Before the officer could respond, Brianna reached into her briefcase once more, pulling out a pristine business card. She extended it toward him with a cool, practiced motion. "Here," she said, "since you seem so interested in my business, let me make it official. Brianna Ellis, Esquire, criminal defense attorney, and trust me, I know exactly what you just violated." The older officer froze, his expression shifting rapidly from anger to dawning realization. The crowd around them erupted into cheers and laughter, their support for Brianna reaching a fever pitch. "Wait," someone in the crowd called out, "she's a lawyer." "Oh, this is gold," Brianna continued, her voice ringing out above the chaos. "You know what the best part is? You don't even realize how deep a hole you've dug yourself into." She stepped closer to him, her voice lowering so only he could hear. "But don't worry, you'll understand soon enough." The officer's mouth opened to protest, but no words came out. Instead, he turned to the younger officer, his panic now visible. "We need to get out of here," he muttered, though his voice carried enough for Brianna to hear. "Not so fast," she said, her tone sharp as a whip. "You don't get to walk away from this. Not after what you've done." The older officer froze again, his shoulders stiffening. The younger one looked torn, his gaze darting between Brianna, the crowd, and his increasingly frazzled colleague. "Ma'am," the younger officer began cautiously, "we don't want to escalate this any further, no." Brianna cut him off, her voice unwavering. "What you want is to sweep this under the rug, but that's not happening. Not today, not ever. If he thinks he can racially profile me, humiliate me in public, and walk away without consequences, he's sorely mistaken." The crowd erupted into cheers once more, their energy palpable. Brianna's unwavering confidence and refusal to back down had galvanized them, turning what had started as a tense confrontation into a powerful moment of solidarity. The older officer looked like he wanted to disappear, his confident demeanor shattered. And yet Brianna wasn't done. She knew she was in control now, and she intended to make this a lesson he'd never forget. The older officer's hand twitched at his side, as though he wanted to grab his radio. His cuff sent a thing that could restore the authority that was now slipping from his grasp. But he didn't move. The weight of the cameras, the crowd, and most of all, Brianna's unwavering presence kept him frozen in place. Brianna took a step forward, her heels clicking against the pavement with an air of precision and finality. "Let's recap, shall we?" She began, her tone as sharp as a courtroom cross-examination. "You arrived here with no probable cause, accused me of attempting to steal my own car, refused to verify basic facts, and threatened me with detention, all because you assumed I didn't belong." The officer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The younger officer shifted uneasily, his expression betraying a mix of discomfort and growing respect for Brianna. "And let's not forget," Brianna continued, her voice rising slightly for the benefit of the crowd, "the baseless accusation that my briefcase contained tools to commit a crime. Newsflash, it contains legal briefs. But I'm guessing you've never been on the receiving end of one, have you, officer?" The crowd roared with laughter and cheers, and a woman in the front shouted, "School him, sis." Brianna didn't break eye contact with the older officer, her gaze steady and unrelenting. I'm not just some random woman you decided to harass today. I'm an attorney who specializes in cases like this. Do you know what that means?" The officer's face, already flushed, turned a deeper shade of red. It means," she interrupted smoothly, "that I know your department's policies and procedures better than you do. It means I know exactly how many laws you just violated. And it means I have the resources and the platform to make sure your actions today are exposed." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their energy shifting from supportive to emboldened. A few people began chanting, "Justice, justice." Others joined in, the chant gaining momentum until it echoed down the street. The younger officer raised his hands in an attempt to calm the crowd. "All right, everyone. Let's try to de-escalate," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. But Brianna wasn't finished. She turned her attention to him, her tone softening slightly, but still carrying the weight of her conviction. "De-escalation should have started the moment your colleague arrived and chose to harass me without cause. Instead, he escalated, and now you want to clean up his mess. Instead, he escalated, and now you want to clean up his mess." The younger officer hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. Brianna stepped back, addressing the crowd directly. "This is what accountability looks like," she said, her voice carrying over the chants. "We can't let moments like this slide. If we do, they'll keep happening to me, to you, to your kids. Enough is enough." The crowd erupted into cheers again, their collective voices ringing out in agreement. The older officer looked visibly shaken now, his earlier bravado completely gone. He glanced at the younger officer, who seemed at a loss for what to do next. "Here's what's going to happen," Brianna said, her voice cutting through the noise. She stepped closer to the older officer, her words slow and deliberate. "You're going to issue me a public apology right here, right now. Then, you're going to give me your badge number and the name of your supervisor. And if I don't see action from your department within the week, you'll be hearing from me and every civil rights organization I work with." To make myself clear, the crowd fell silent, their collective focus laser-sharp on the officer. He looked as though he wanted to argue, to push back, but he quickly realized there was no winning this battle. He began, his voice barely audible. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I'm sorry." Brianna raised a brow, her expression unimpressed. "You'll need to do better than that." The officer swallowed hard, glancing at the crowd before. Looking back at Brianna, "I apologize," he said more clearly, his tone begrudging but unmistakably defeated, "for any misunderstanding." "That's a start," Brianna replied, her voice cool. "Now your badge number." He rattled it off, his voice stiff. "And your supervisor's name," she pressed. He gave the name, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the moment bore down on him. Brianna nodded once, tucking the information away in her mind. "Good. Now you can go." The crowd burst into cheers again as Brianna stood tall, her composure unshaken. The younger officer hesitated for a moment before nodding at his colleague, signaling for him to leave. As the officers walked back to their patrol car, the older one muttering under his breath, Brianna turned back to the crowd, a small, triumphant smile breaking through her stoic exterior. She had stood her ground, and the victory belonged not just to her, but to everyone watching. As the patrol car pulled away, the energy in the air shifted. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many people still buzzing with admiration for Brianna's poise and determination. A few approached her directly, offering words of poise and determination. A few approached her directly, offering words of support. "That was incredible," a young woman said, her phone still in hand. "You kept your cool the entire time. I would have lost it." Brianna smiled politely but briefly, her mind already turning toward what came next. "Thank you," she said, her tone gracious but distant. "But this isn't over. It never is." A middle-aged man stepped forward, holding out his card. "I work with a local advocacy group," he said earnestly. "We could use someone like you. Please reach out." This kind of injustice is why we fight. She took the card with a nod, slipping it into her briefcase. I appreciate that. We'll be in touch. Despite the lingering conversations and compliments, Brianna's focus remained on the bigger picture. This moment was a victory, but it was just one skirmish in a much larger war. As a lawyer, she had seen firsthand how systemic injustice was baked into the very fabric of institutions, and she knew that real change required more than just a viral video. Miss Ellis, a voice called out, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to see a young man in a hoodie jogging toward her, his phone still recording. He stopped a few feet away, clearly nervous but determined. I just wanted to say, you're a hero for real. What you did back there, it was inspiring. Brianna tilted her head slightly, studying him. He couldn't have been more than 20, his earnestness shining through despite his timid demeanor. I appreciate that, she said, softening her tone, but don't mistake me for a hero. I'm just someone who refused to be silenced. He nodded quickly, his admiration undiminished. Still, a lot of us wouldn't know what to do in a situation like that. You gave us hope. The weight of his words settled over her, and for a brief moment, Brianna allowed herself to feel the impact of what had just happened. The young man wasn't wrong. Moments like this could spark something greater, inspiring others to stand up and demand better. Thank you, she said finally, her voice quieter now. But don't stop at hope. Take action. Speak up when you see something wrong, even if it's uncomfortable. That's how we make change. He nodded again, his expression resolute. I will. I promise. As he walked away, Brianna finally allowed herself to exhale. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation began to fade, replaced by a familiar mix of exhaustion and resolve. She glanced at her car, its sleek surface gleaming in the afternoon sun, and sighed. It was a symbol of her success, yes, but also a reminder of how quickly others sought to strip that success away. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her attention. She pulled it out to see a text from her assistant, Zoe. You were amazing. I'm already seeing clips online. Do you want me to call a press contact? Brianna hesitated for a moment before replying. Not yet. Let's see where this goes first. She wasn't naive enough to believe the story would end here. The footage from today would likely go viral, drawing both praise and criticism. The department would be forced to respond, perhaps even issue a public statement. But Brianna wasn't interested in platitudes or half measures. She wanted accountability, real and tangible, and she was prepared to fight for it. Sliding her phone back into her pocket, she climbed into her car and sat for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel. The echoes of the confrontation played in her mind, each detail etched into her memory. She thought of the officer's arrogance, the assumptions he had made about her without hesitation, and she thought of how often similar scenarios unfolded across the country, far from the eyes of cameras or witnesses. No more, she murmured to herself, her resolve hardening. Starting the car, she pulled into traffic, her mind already crafting her next steps. She would use every tool at her disposal, her legal expertise, her platform, and the public's newfound attention, to turn this moment into something lasting. Because for Simone Ellis-esque, fighting back wasn't just a matter of principle, it was a way of life. As Simone drove through the city, her mind churned with plans. She could already see the chessboard in her mind, the pieces moving into place. The footage from today wasn't just a record of her experience. It was evidence, and evidence was power. She intended to wield it carefully but decisively. The first stop was her office, a sleek downtown space on the 15th floor of a high-rise. It was a testament to years of relentless work, late nights, and a refusal to settle for anything less than excellence. The gold lettering on the glass door read, Ellis & Associates Criminal Defense and Civil Rights Advocacy. Brianna strode in, the tension from earlier still lingering in her body, but her focus was razor sharp. Zoe, her assistant, popped her head out from behind her desk. Brianna, you're trending, Zoe said, holding up her phone with a wry smile. It's everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, even TikTok. Everyone's talking about what happened. Brianna raised a brow. Already. Oh, yeah, Zoe said, her voice tinged with excitement. A corner of her lips. Social media moves fast. Let's make sure we're ahead of it. She set her briefcase down on Zoe's desk. Pull the best clips, the ones that show exactly what happened. No edits, no embellishments, just the facts. Zoe nodded, her fingers already flying across her keyboard. Got it. Are we issuing a statement? Not yet, Brianna said, her tone measured. Let the story breathe for a moment. People need time to react, to get angry, to demand answers. When we speak, it'll be with a plan. Zoe glanced up, her expression curious. And what's the plan? Brianna leaned against the desk, her expression curious. And what's the plan? Brianna leaned against the desk, her arms crossed. First, we file a formal complaint with the department, not just about the officer's behavior, but about the broader culture that allows it. Then we escalate. Media interviews, op-eds, collaborations with advocacy groups. We make it impossible for them to sweep this under the rug. Zoe grinned. You're amazing, you know that. Brianna's smirk softened into a genuine smile. I just know how to play the game. As Zoe got to work, Brianna retreated to her office. The expansive window offered a panoramic view of the game. As Zoe got to work, Brianna retreated to her office. The expansive window offered a panoramic view of the city, but her gaze was fixed inward, her thoughts racing. She knew the next few days would be a whirlwind. The department would likely issue a vague statement about looking into the incident, and the officer might even be placed on administrative leave. But Brianna wasn't after superficial fixes. She wanted structural change, policies rewritten, training overhauled, accountability enforced. Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. This time it was a call. Mississippi Ellis, said a familiar voice on the other, and it was Julian Carter, a prominent civil rights attorney, and one of Brianna's longtime allies. I just saw the video. Are you all right? I'm fine, Julian, Brianna replied, angry. But fine good, because this isn't just about you, Malik said, his tone serious. This is about every black person who's ever been profiled, harassed, or silenced. This moment is bigger than you or me, and you know it. I do, Brianna said softly, and I intend to make it count. Then let's strategize, Julian said. You've got the spotlight right now. Let's use it. They spent the next hour discussing their approach, legal angles, media outreach, and potential partnerships with other organizations. By the time Brianna hung up, her resolve was stronger than ever. Her office phone rang next. Zoe's voice came through the intercom. It's the police department. Her office phone rang next. Zoe's voice came through the intercom. It's the police department. They want to schedule a meeting. Brianna raised an eyebrow. Her curiosity piqued. Interesting. Tell them I'm available tomorrow morning, and make sure the press knows about it. Zoe laughed softly. You're ruthless. No, Brianna corrected, her voice firm. I'm prepared. As she hung up the phone, Brianna leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with possibilities. The officer might have thought today was just another routine encounter, but he'd misjudged her entirely. This was more than just a personal victory. It was an opportunity to shine a light on a broken system. And Simone Ellis had no intention of wasting it. The next morning, Simone arrived at the police department headquarters. The imposing brick building loomed over the bustling downtown street, its large glass doors reflecting the morning sunlight. Brianna stepped out of her car, dressed in a sharp black suit and carrying a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. The air was electric. Several reporters and photographers had already gathered, cameras flashing as they spotted her. Miss Ellis, over here, one called out, microphone extended. Do you have any comment on the incident yesterday? Is the officer facing any disciplinary action? Another shouted. Brianna paused at the steps, her calm and deliberate demeanor commanding attention. She turned toward the reporters, her expression composed but firm. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying effortlessly over the hum of chatter. "While I cannot comment on the specifics of yesterday's events, I can tell you this. I'm here today to ensure that justice is not only pursued, but achieved. This isn't just about mates, about accountability, transparency, and a system that must do better for everyone it serves. Thank you." Without waiting for further questions, she ascended the steps and entered the building. The air inside was cooler, quieter, but the tension was palpable. An officer at the front desk directed her to a conference room where a group of people waited, their expressions varying from neutral to wary. At the head of the table sat Captain Brian, a grizzled man in his early 60s with a stern face and sharp eyes. Beside him was a woman in a crisp navy suit, Chief Veronica, the department's recently appointed head of internal affairs. Brianna had done her research and knew Veronica had a reputation for being non-nonsense but politically savvy. "Miss Ellis," Chief Veronica said, rising to shake her hand. "Thank you for meeting with us." "Chief Veronica," Brianna replied, her handshake firm. She turned to Captain Brian, nodding slightly, "Captain." They exchanged pleasantries, but the atmosphere remained tense. Brianna took her seat, placing her portfolio neatly in front of her. "I'm sure you're aware of why we're here," Brianna began, her tone professional but unwavering. "Yesterday's incident was not an isolated event. It's part of a larger, systemic issue that your department has failed to address adequately. I'm here to ensure that changes are made not just for me, but for every individual who's experienced similar treatment." Captain Brian bristled slightly, his jaw tightening. "Miss Ellis, while we regret what happened, it's important to note that the officer in question was acting within his training. With respect, Captain," Brianna interrupted, her tone cutting but calm. "If his behavior yesterday reflects his training, then your training is the problem." Chief Veronica raised a hand, her expression carefully neutral. "Let's take a step back," she said. "We've reviewed the footage and spoken to the officer involved. While I won't comment on any potential disciplinary actions at this time, I can assure you that we take this matter very seriously." Brianna leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking onto Veronica. "Taking it seriously isn't enough, Chief. The public deserves transparency, and your officers need accountability. Without those, this department will continue to erode the trust of the very community it's supposed to protect." Veronica nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I understand your concerns, Ms. Ellis. What are you proposing?" Brianna opened her portfolio, pulling out a document and sliding it across the table. "This is a preliminary outline of policy changes I am recommending. It includes mandatory de-escalation training, implicit bias workshops, and an independent review board for incidents involving allegations of misconduct." Captain Brian frowned. "That's a tall order," he said, his tone skeptical. "It's a necessary one," Brianna countered. "Your department has a choice. Take meaningful steps toward reform or continue to face public backlash and legal challenges. Believe me, I have no shortage of resources to ensure that happens." Veronica studied the document, her expression unreadable. Finally, she set it down and met Brianna's gaze. "These are ambitious proposals," she said, "but not impossible. I'll need time to review them in detail." Brianna nodded. "Take all the time you need, but understand this. The public is watching, and they won't wait forever." The meeting continued for another hour, with Brianna methodically outlining her points and refusing to back down under pressure. By the time it ended, it was clear that she had planted the seeds for change and made it impossible for the department to ignore her demands. As she exited the building, the reporters outside swarmed her again, their questions flying fast and furious. What did they say? Is the officer being fired? What happens next? Brianna paused briefly, her expression calm but determined. What happens next, she said, is accountability. I presented the department with a clear path forward. Now it's up to them to take it. But rest assured, I'll be holding them to their word. This is only the beginning. The crowd erupted in a flurry of activity, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward as Brianna descended the steps. She had made her stand, and now it was up to the system to respond or face the consequences. As she slid into her car and drove away, her phone buzzed with messages of support from colleagues, friends, and strangers alike. But Brianna wasn't looking for praise. She was looking for progress, and she wouldn't rest until she had it. By the time Brianna returned to her office, the storm she had set in motion was already gathering strength. Her inbox was flooded with emails, journalists requesting interviews, advocacy groups offering their support, and community leaders eager to collaborate. On social media, the video of her confrontation with the officer had gone viral, racking up millions of views and sparking a national conversation about racial profiling and police accountability. Brianna sat at her desk, scrolling through the endless stream of comments and messages. For every outpouring of support, there was a handful of detractors accusing her of making it about race or overreacting. She ignored the negativity. She'd faced worse, and none of it had ever deterred her before. Zoe appeared at the door, her face alight with excitement. "You're everywhere," she said, holding up her tablet. CNN just picked up the story, and the hashtag #HashJustice for Brianna is trending in 5 countries. Brianna raised an eyebrow but didn't look up from her laptop. "And the department, any statements yet?" Zoe nodded, pulling up a post on the department's official social media page. "They just released this." She handed the tablet to Brianna, who read the post carefully. "The Atlanta Police Department is committed to serving and protecting all members of our community. We are aware of the incident involving Ms. Brianna Ellis and are conducting a thorough investigation. We take these matters seriously and are reviewing our policies and procedures to ensure such incidents do not occur in the future." Brianna scoffed, setting the tablet aside. "A typical non-apology. We're aware. We're investigating. They're trying to run out the clock and hope the public forgets." Zoe smirked. Clearly they don't know who they're dealing with. Brianna's phone buzzed on her desk. It was Brianna Carter again, his timing impeccable. She answered on speaker. "Malik," she greeted him. "Have you seen the department statement?" "I have," he said, his tone dry. Classic deflection, but it's not enough. The public wants action, and you've got the momentum to demand it. "I intend to," Brianna said, her voice resolute. "What's the latest on our legal front?" "We're drafting the complaint now," Julian replied. "It's airtight: civil rights violations, unlawful detention, racial profiling. Once we file, the department will have no choice but to respond in court." "Good," Brianna said. "And to the media, are they aligned?" "They are," Julian confirmed. "Everyone from local outlets to national networks wants your story. But we need to control the narrative, focus on the systemic issues, not just the individual officer." "That's always been the goal," Brianna said. As she hung up, Zoe leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed. "So, what's the next move, boss?" Brianna leaned back in her chair, her mind whirring. "We keep the pressure on. Schedule an interview with one of the major networks, preferably someone with a platform that can push this conversation forward, and draft a statement from our firm highlighting the policy changes I propose to the department. Let's make sure the public knows exactly what we're fighting for." Zoe nodded, scribbling notes on her clipboard. "Consider it done." Hours later, Brianna sat in the studio of a major news network. The bright lights and cameras trained on her as the host introduced her. "Tonight, we're joined by Brianna Ellis, the attorney whose recent encounter with the police has sparked a national dialogue on racial profiling and accountability. Ms. Ellis, thank you for being here. Thank you for having me," Simone replied, her tone measured and composed. The host leaned forward, his expression serious. "The video of your interaction with the officer has been viewed millions of times. What message do you hope to send by sharing your story?" Brianna met his gaze, her voice steady. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about a system that continues to fail marginalized communities. What happened to me happens to countless others every day, but not everyone has the privilege or the platform to fight back." I want to use this moment to demand change not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been silenced or dehumanized. The host nodded, his expression thoughtful. And what would you say to those who claim this was an isolated incident, or that the officer was just doing his job? Brianna's eyes sharpened, her words cutting through the air like a blade. I'd say that's exactly the problem. When bias and profiling are baked into the system, they stop being isolated incidents and start becoming the norm. We need systemic reform, not excuses. The interview continued with Brianna articulating her points with the precision of a seasoned litigator. By the time it aired, her words had reached millions more, further solidifying her position as a leading voice for justice. As she left the studio that evening, Brianna knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but she was ready. This fight wasn't just person, it was a mission, and she wasn't about to back down. A week later, Brianna sat in her office, her desk cluttered with papers, emails, and news clippings about the case. The public outcry had only grown louder, with protests forming outside the police department and advocacy groups calling for sweeping reforms. The hashtag Justice for Brianna had sparked a broader movement, shining a light on other incidents of racial profiling across the nation. Her assistant, Zoe, knocked lightly on the door and stepped in. "You're going to want to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. Brianna took the device, her eyes narrowing as she read the headline. Atlanta police officer resigns amid racial profiling allegations. Department promises reforms. The article detailed how the officer involved in Brianna's incident, racial profiling allegations, department promises reforms. The article detailed how the officer involved in Brianna's incident had stepped down following the department's internal investigation. Chief Veronica had issued a public apology on behalf of the department, acknowledging the need for systemic changes and pledging to implement several of the reforms Brianna had proposed, including mandatory bias training and the creation of an independent oversight board. Brianna leaned back in her chair, letting the news sink in. It was a victory, but not the kind that left her feeling triumphant. One officer resigning, and a few policy changes were only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over. Zoe broke the silence. "The press is asking for your response. What do you want to say?" Brianna tapped her fingers on the armrest, her mind racing. Finally, she stood, her expression resolute. "Draft a statement, something clear and direct." Zoe nodded, ready to take notes. Brianna began dictating, her voice steady. "While the resignation of the officer involved is a step in the right direction, it does not absolve the system that allowed this to happen. True justice requires more than apologies and promises. It demands accountability, transparency, and continuous action. I will continue to work with community leaders, advocacy groups, and policymakers to ensure that these changes are not just words on paper, but actions that transform lives." This is not the end of the conversation. It's only the beginning. Zoe looked up, her admiration evident. "You're incredible. You know that?" Brianna offered a small smile. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." Later that evening, Brianna sat alone and smiled. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." Later that evening, Brianna sat alone in her apartment, the city lights twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The weight of the past week pressed on her, but so did a deep sense of purpose. She thought about the young man in the hoodie who had called her a hero, about the countless messages of support from strangers, and even about the detractors who tried to dismiss her as overreacting. This fight wasn't new. It wasn't even unique, but it was hers. And she had the tools, the voice, and the platform to make a difference. Her phone buzzed again, a notification from a news outlet featuring her interview alongside a headline about the department's reforms. Brianna watched the segment for a moment, her own words playing back to her. "This isn't just about me. It's about building a system where dignity and respect are the standard, not the exception. And I won't stop until we get there." She set her phone down and leaned back, her gaze fixed on the city skyline. For a moment, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She hadn't just won a battle. She had lit a spark. And as long as it burned, she would keep pushing, satisfied smile. She hadn't just won a battle. She had lit a spark. And as long as it burned, she would keep pushing, keep fighting, and keep demanding more. Because Brianna Ellis didn't just know the law. She knew how to change it. And she wasn't stopping until justice was more than a word.